What if I told you that while you were sleeping last Friday night, someone walked away with $100 million in less than 2 hours? Not through some elaborate bank robbery with masks and guns. Not through years of embezzlement schemes. But through a method so brilliant, so perfectly executed, that the FBI called it impossible, and the man who did it has never been found. Have you ever been so desperate that you'd consider doing something you never thought possible? Maybe you faced crushing medical bills, or watched your life savings disappear, or felt the weight of financial ruin pressing down on your shoulders. That moment when you realize everything you've worked for could vanish. It changes people. It transforms ordinary, law-abiding citizens into something else entirely. Before we go any further, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the cases we cover on True Crime Case Notes will challenge everything you think you know about human nature and the lengths people will go when pushed to their breaking point. Tonight's story centers on Theodore Casimir, a man who spent 25 years being the most trusted person in his small Pennsylvania town. For over 2 decades, families turned to Teddy during their darkest hours. When death visited their homes, he was the calm, compassionate professional who handled everything with dignity and care. Parents, grandparents, beloved family members. Teddy treated them all like his own family. But here's what makes this case absolutely mind-blowing. In exactly 100 minutes, from 11:47 p.m. to 1:27 a.m. on one March night in 2019, this same trusted funeral director managed to steal more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. He didn't just rob a bank. He didn't hack into some computer system. He used his reputation, his relationships, and a loophole that only someone in his unique profession could exploit. The FBI launched one of their largest manhunts in history. Interpol issued international alerts. Every major news network covered the story. And yet, 5 years later, Theodore Casimir has vanished without leaving a single trace. How does a small-town funeral director pull off what experts are calling the perfect heist? How do you steal $100 million in 100 minutes and fool the entire federal banking system? And most importantly, where do you disappear to when the whole world is looking for you? The answers will shock you, because this isn't just a story about money. It's about how far ordinary people will go when life pushes them past their breaking point. Theodore "Teddy" Casimir wasn't just any funeral director. He was Millbrook's golden standard of trust and reliability. Standing 6 feet tall with prematurely silver hair and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Teddy represented the 3rd generation of his family to run Casimir and Sons Funeral Home. For 25 years, he had been the steady hand that guided grieving families through their worst moments. Local residents would often say Teddy had the perfect temperament for the business. He was patient when families couldn't make decisions. Detail-oriented when handling final arrangements. Blessed with an uncanny ability to remain calm under pressure, even when emotions ran high and tempers flared during family disputes over funeral costs or burial wishes. But what truly set Teddy apart was his genuine compassion. He remembered every family he served, often checking in months later during anniversaries or holidays. When the Kowalski family couldn't afford their father's funeral, Teddy quietly absorbed the costs without telling anyone. When elderly Mrs. Patterson died alone with no relatives, Teddy personally ensured she received a dignified service. This reputation wasn't just good for business. It was everything. Bank managers trusted him completely. Insurance agents fast-tracked his claims. Probate attorneys recommended him to out-of-town families. In a profession built on trust during people's most vulnerable moments, Teddy Casimir was considered unshakable. Then 2017 arrived like a freight train carrying devastating news. Margaret, Teddy's wife of 32 years, received a diagnosis that would change everything: stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Despite their comfortable middle-class lifestyle built over decades of careful saving, the astronomical medical bills began eating through their finances like acid through metal. Margaret's experimental treatments weren't covered by insurance. Each month brought bills exceeding $15,000. Teddy watched helplessly as their retirement fund evaporated first, then their children's college accounts, then their emergency savings. The medical center demanded payment up front for each treatment cycle, and hope wasn't free. Within 18 months, Teddy was forced to take out a second mortgage on the funeral home, the business that had been in his family for 3 generations. The same building where his grandfather had started with nothing but determination and respect for the dead was now collateral for his wife's fight for life. Margaret passed away in early 2018, leaving Teddy not only heartbroken but financially destroyed. The funeral home that had been his family's legacy was now mortgaged beyond its value. Creditors called daily. The business that had sustained 3 generations of Casimirs was drowning in debt accumulated trying to save one life. Here's the crucial lesson: external pressures don't discriminate. They don't care about your reputation, your character, or how many people trust you. Financial devastation can corrupt anyone, from the most respected community leader to your next-door neighbor. When desperation reaches a certain level, even the most ethical person starts considering options they never imagined possible. During this darkest period, while Teddy sat in his empty house surrounded by medical bills and mortgage statements, he discovered something that would transform him from grieving widower into criminal mastermind. That discovery came from the most unexpected source. The revelation that would change everything came from Beverly Rothschild, a sharp-minded accountant in her 50s who specialized in small business finances. Beverly had been handling Casimir and Sons books for over a decade, and she was conducting a routine financial review when Teddy's world shifted forever. "You know, Teddy," Beverly said, adjusting her reading glasses as she flipped through federal banking regulations, "there's this obscure rule about estate funds that most people don't understand. When someone dies, their financial assets get temporarily held in special accounts during probate proceedings." She continued explaining while Teddy listened with growing interest. These accounts existed in a gray area of federal oversight. They were monitored, yes, but not with the same intensity as regular banking transactions. The brief window between death and official documentation created a unique vulnerability in the system. Beverly had no idea she was handing Teddy the key to the perfect crime. Teddy's analytical mind immediately began connecting dots that Beverly couldn't see. As a funeral director, he had access to death certificates before they were officially filed with state databases. He understood the precise timing of when banks froze accounts, when insurance payouts were processed, and when families typically accessed deceased relatives' finances. More importantly, Teddy had spent 25 years building relationships throughout the region. Bank managers knew him personally. Insurance agents trusted his word completely. Probate attorneys recommended his services to families from 3 counties away. His reputation was his greatest asset. But could it become his greatest weapon? The question that began haunting Teddy's sleepless nights was this: what if someone could intercept those funds during the brief window between death and official documentation? What if that someone had the perfect cover, the right relationships, and access to all the necessary information? For weeks, Teddy wrestled with thoughts he never imagined himself having. He would sit in his office late at night, surrounded by sympathy cards and funeral arrangements, researching banking protocols and estate law. The ethical man who had spent decades comforting families was now studying how to exploit the system that protected their loved ones' final assets. This is where we need to pause and ask ourselves a critical question. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think desperation can ever justify crossing ethical boundaries? When medical bills are crushing your family and creditors are threatening to take everything you've worked for, where do you draw the line between survival and crime? The truth is, Teddy stood at a crossroads that many of us hope we'll never face. He could accept financial ruin, lose the family business, and spend his remaining years paying off Margaret's medical debt. Or he could use his unique position, his trusted reputation, and this newfound knowledge to solve his problems permanently. As Teddy researched deeper into banking regulations and estate procedures, he realized something that made his pulse quicken. This wasn't just theoretical. It was absolutely possible. His profession gave him access to information that others couldn't obtain. His reputation meant people would trust him without question. His understanding of death certificates and probate timing meant he could execute such a plan with precision. But executing this scheme would require more than just knowledge. It would require help. Teddy would need people in specific positions, people with access to systems he couldn't reach alone. People who, like him, might be desperate enough to take risks they never thought possible. The transformation was complete. The grieving widower who had spent his career helping families through their darkest hours was now planning to exploit that same trust for the largest heist in Pennsylvania history. The question wasn't whether he could do it anymore. The question was whether he would. Teddy understood that pulling off this heist would require a carefully assembled team, but he couldn't simply advertise for criminal partners. Instead, he needed to identify people who were already vulnerable, already desperate, and already within his reach. What happened next demonstrates how master manipulators exploit human weakness with surgical precision. His first recruit was Danny Kowalski, a former client whose father Teddy had buried just 2 years earlier. During the funeral arrangements, Teddy had noticed Danny's obvious financial stress. The cheap suit, the worry lines, the way he flinched when discussing costs. A little research revealed that Danny worked as a systems administrator for the regional branch of Merchants and Farmers Bank, and that his gambling addiction had left him drowning in debt. Teddy's approach was masterful. He didn't mention crime or robbery. Instead, he reached out to Danny 6 months after the funeral, expressing concern about how he was coping with his father's loss. During their coffee meeting, Teddy casually mentioned how grateful he was for Danny's father's military service, then asked if Danny had ever considered how banking systems handled veterans' benefits. "You know, Danny, I've been wondering about something," Teddy said, leaning forward with apparent concern. "Sometimes families need quick access to accounts when there are emergencies, but the paperwork takes forever. Is there a way to expedite things from the bank's end?" Danny, desperate to help someone who had shown such kindness during his father's funeral, began explaining banking protocols. Teddy listened intently, asking innocent-sounding questions that gradually revealed exactly how the system worked. When Teddy finally made his proposition, $50,000 cash for temporary access to certain banking protocols, Danny was already psychologically invested in helping this man who had been so good to his family. Isabella Martinez presented a different challenge. As a clerk in the county registrar's office responsible for processing death certificates, she held a crucial piece of Teddy's puzzle. Isabella was a single mother struggling to support 3 children on a government salary that barely covered rent, let alone groceries and school supplies. Teddy's manipulation of Isabella was even more subtle. He began by praising her efficiency whenever he filed death certificates, commenting on how professional and thorough she was. He started bringing her small gifts, coffee for her long shifts, toys for her children during holidays. When Isabella mentioned her financial struggles, Teddy listened with apparent sympathy. "Isabella, you work so hard for this community," he would say. "It's criminal how little they pay someone with your skills and dedication." When Teddy finally approached her with his request, a 30-minute delay in filing certain death certificates in exchange for $25,000, he framed it as helping families avoid bureaucratic complications. Isabella, who had grown to trust and respect Teddy, saw it as a minor favor for someone who had always treated her with kindness. The final piece was Patricia "Patty" Henderson, a freelance graphic designer who occasionally created marketing materials for the funeral home. Unlike the others, Patty would be an unwitting accomplice. Teddy had studied her work and recognized her exceptional talent for document reproduction and design. Teddy hired Patty for what he described as a confidential client project, involving the creation of extremely realistic memorial documents. He paid her triple her usual rate and emphasized the need for absolute discretion due to the sensitive nature of the family's request. Patty, grateful for the well-paying work, never suspected she was creating the forged documents that would enable the heist. Here's the crucial lesson about how criminals exploit vulnerability. They don't start with the crime. They start with relationship building, trust establishment, and emotional manipulation. Teddy identified what each person needed most. Danny needed money and respect. Isabella needed financial security and appreciation. Patty needed well-paying work and professional recognition. He provided these things gradually, creating psychological debt before ever asking for anything in return. Over 6 months, Teddy carefully cultivated these relationships while simultaneously studying banking regulations, estate procedures, and money transfer protocols. He opened shell companies, established offshore accounts, and created a complex financial labyrinth designed to hide stolen funds. Every detail was planned with the same meticulous care he brought to funeral arrangements. By March 2019, Teddy had assembled the perfect team without any of them fully understanding their role in what would become the crime of the century. Each person believed they were helping a trusted friend with a minor favor. None realized they were about to become accomplices in the most audacious heist in Pennsylvania history. All Teddy needed now was the right target and the perfect opportunity. Harrison Whitmore was everything Teddy needed in a target, though the 89-year-old industrialist had no idea he was being studied like a specimen under a microscope. For over a decade, Whitmore had lived as a recluse in his mansion on the outskirts of Millbrook, emerging only for essential errands and the occasional visit to his late wife's grave. Whitmore's isolation wasn't born from eccentricity. It was grief. After his beloved wife Eleanor passed away in 2008, Harrison retreated from the world that no longer held meaning for him. He had no children, no close friends, and his nearest relatives were distant cousins scattered across the country who contacted him maybe twice a year, usually around holidays. But what made Harrison the perfect target wasn't his loneliness. It was his wealth and how he managed it. Decades of shrewd real estate investments had built Harrison a fortune exceeding $100 million, but his old-school approach to finances created the exact vulnerability Teddy needed. Instead of consolidating his wealth with one institution, Harrison maintained accounts across 7 different banks throughout the region, a habit formed during the Great Depression when his father taught him never to trust all his money to one place. This spread of assets created a crucial advantage. No single bank had complete visibility into Harrison's total wealth, making unusual transactions less likely to trigger immediate red flags. More importantly, Harrison's reclusive nature meant that unusual account activity might go unnoticed for days or even weeks. Teddy had been Harrison's designated funeral director for over 15 years, ever since he had handled Eleanor's services with such compassion and professionalism. Harrison trusted Teddy completely, perhaps the only person in Millbrook he still trusted. This relationship gave Teddy legitimate access to Harrison's home and knowledge of his habits, his health conditions, and most crucially, his financial arrangements. For months, Teddy had been preparing for the moment when Harrison's failing health would create the opportunity he needed. The 89-year-old suffered from severe heart disease, diabetes, and had already survived 2 minor heart attacks. It wasn't a matter of if Harrison would have another cardiac event. It was when. That one arrived on a Friday evening in late March 2019. Harrison was alone in his mansion, watching television in his study, when the massive heart attack struck. His housekeeper had left hours earlier, and Harrison's habit of ignoring his phone meant no one would check on him until Monday morning at the earliest. At 10:23 p.m., Harrison managed to dial 911 before collapsing. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, but it was already too late. They worked frantically for over an hour, trying every resuscitation technique available, but Harrison Whitmore was declared dead at 11:47 p.m. As the longtime family funeral director, Teddy was among the first people contacted. When his phone rang at 11:51 p.m., he answered on the first ring. He had been waiting by his phone every night for weeks. Everything was aligning perfectly. It was Friday night, meaning most bank executives were home for the weekend. Harrison had died alone with no family members present to complicate matters. The death occurred late enough that official systems would be operating with minimal oversight until Monday morning. Teddy had exactly the window he needed. As he drove toward Harrison's mansion, Teddy's hands were steady on the steering wheel. His heart rate was normal. His breathing was controlled. After months of preparation, years of reputation building, and decades of professional experience, this was simply another call to handle a deceased client. If you're amazed by the level of planning and psychological manipulation that went into setting up this heist, hit that like button. The precision required to coordinate all these elements is absolutely mind-blowing. But here's what makes this story truly incredible. The actual execution of the heist was even more impressive than the preparation. What happened next would later be described by FBI investigators as a symphony of criminal coordination that bordered on the impossible. Here's the minute-by-minute breakdown of how Theodore Casimir pulled off the heist of the century. 11:47 p.m. Death pronounced. Harrison Whitmore was officially declared dead after paramedics exhausted every resuscitation attempt. The lead paramedic signed the preliminary death documentation, and the coroner was notified. In that moment, the clock started ticking on Teddy's carefully planned operation. 11:52 p.m. The machine activates. Exactly 5 minutes after Harrison's death, Teddy sent a coded text message to Isabella Martinez. Eleanor's flowers need arranging before dawn. This seemingly innocent message about Harrison's deceased wife was actually the signal Isabella had been waiting for. She immediately drove to the county registrar's office, using her after-hours access to begin processing Harrison's death certificate. 12 a.m. Certificate processing begins. Isabella began entering Harrison's death information into the state database, but instead of submitting it immediately as protocol required, she held the completed certificate in the system without final submission. This created a crucial 30-minute window where Harrison was officially dead according to preliminary records, but the automatic notifications to financial institutions hadn't been triggered yet. Meanwhile, Teddy arrived at Harrison's mansion under the completely legitimate guise of preparing for transport. The paramedics and coroner knew him well, and nobody questioned his presence. What they didn't know was that Teddy carried with him a briefcase containing months of carefully forged documents, power of attorney papers, estate executor credentials, and bank authorization forms that looked absolutely authentic. 12:05 a.m. First contact. Teddy made his first call to Merchants and Farmers Bank, where Danny Kowalski was working the night shift. "Danny, this is Teddy Casimir. I'm at the Whitmore residence handling arrangements. Harrison passed tonight, and I need to execute some emergency transfers to prevent probate complications." Danny, who had been expecting this call, immediately provided Teddy with the access codes and account verification information needed to initiate transfers. To anyone listening, it sounded like routine business between trusted professionals. 12:15 a.m. The systematic robbery begins. Using Harrison's own phone and the forged authorization documents, Teddy began contacting each of Harrison's 7 banks. His approach was identical at each institution: identify himself as the emergency estate executor, reference his decades-long relationship with the deceased, and explain the urgent need to transfer funds to prevent legal complications. Here's where Teddy's reputation became his most powerful weapon. Bank managers who had known him for 25 years didn't question his late-night calls. After all, death doesn't follow business hours, and Teddy Casimir had always been thorough and professional in handling these matters. 12:25 a.m. First major transfer. The first transfer of $14.2 million from Harrison's primary account at Regional Trust was completed. The money was routed to a shell company Teddy had established months earlier, then immediately transferred again to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Each transaction was carefully calibrated to stay just below federal reporting thresholds that would trigger immediate scrutiny. 12:40 a.m. Chain reaction. By this point, Teddy was operating like a conductor leading an orchestra. While on hold with one bank, he was texting Danny for additional account information. While waiting for transfer confirmations, he was calling the next institution on his list. Every second counted, and every action was precisely timed. 1:05 a.m. The largest score. Whitmore's investment account at First National contained over $32 million in liquid assets. This transfer required additional authorization, but when the bank manager called the Whitmore residence to confirm, Teddy answered Harrison's phone with the perfect tone of somber professionalism. "This is Theodore Casimir, handling arrangements for the family. Yes, the transfers are authorized and urgent." The manager, who had worked with Teddy on dozens of estate matters over the years, processed the transfer without hesitation. 1:20 a.m. Final accounts. The remaining smaller accounts were emptied in rapid succession. Teddy's systematic approach meant that even as exhaustion began setting in, he never missed a detail or made a procedural error. Years of handling complex funeral arrangements under pressure had trained him for exactly this kind of multitasking precision. 1:27 a.m. Mission complete. The final transfer of $8.7 million was completed exactly 100 minutes after Harrison Whitmore's death was officially recorded. In total, Teddy had successfully transferred $103.4 million from 7 different banks into his complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. The money was already halfway around the world, moving through financial institutions in countries with strict banking privacy laws. By the time anyone realized what had happened, recovering the funds would be virtually impossible. 1:30 a.m. Systems trigger. Isabella Martinez finally submitted Harrison's death certificate to the state database, exactly 30 minutes after the final transfer was completed. Automatic notifications were immediately sent to all financial institutions, triggering account freezes and estate protocols. But the notifications were arriving at empty accounts. As Teddy drove away from Harrison's mansion that night, he had successfully executed the most audacious financial crime in American history. The man who had spent his career helping families during their darkest hours had just exploited that same trust to steal more money than most people could comprehend. The truly remarkable part? He still had enough professional integrity to properly embalm Harrison's body and prepare detailed burial instructions before disappearing forever. The scheme might have gone undetected for weeks, possibly months, if not for a coincidence that Teddy couldn't have predicted. Harrison Whitmore's distant cousin, Robert Chen, an accountant living in Seattle, happened to be working late that same Friday night, reconciling his quarterly books. Out of curiosity, something he did maybe twice a year, Robert decided to check on a joint investment account he shared with his elderly cousin. It was a small account, containing only about $50,000, but it served as their family's emergency fund for Harrison's care if he ever needed assisted living. The account was completely empty. Robert's initial reaction was confusion, not alarm. Maybe Harrison had moved the money for tax purposes, or perhaps there was a clerical error. But when Robert tried calling Harrison's home phone repeatedly throughout the weekend and received no answer, worry began creeping in. By Saturday morning, Robert had contacted other family members scattered across the country. Nobody had heard from Harrison in over a week, which wasn't entirely unusual given his reclusive nature, but combined with the empty account, it warranted investigation. When Seattle police conducted a welfare check at Harrison's mansion on Saturday morning, they found the house empty except for a professional note from Casimir and Sons Funeral Home, indicating that the deceased had been transported for preparation services per family request. But when police contacted the funeral home, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. No one there had any record of Harrison Whitmore's death, and Theodore Casimir hadn't been seen since Friday night. The FBI was called in by Sunday afternoon, and what they found was a crime scene that defied belief. Special Agent Catherine Walsh, who had investigated financial crimes for over 15 years, later described it as the most professionally executed heist I've ever encountered. Harrison Whitmore had indeed died on Friday night. His death certificate had been properly filed. All banking transactions appeared to have been conducted with legitimate authorization. Every document looked authentic. Every procedure seemed to follow proper protocols. The problem was that every single piece of paperwork was a masterwork of forgery. As federal agents traced the money transfers, they discovered something that both impressed and infuriated them. The theft had been executed with such precision that it left virtually no digital footprints. The complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts had been established over months, each one carefully designed to obscure the money trail. But perhaps the most humiliating detail for the FBI came when they discovered Harrison Whitmore's body in the funeral home's preparation room. Teddy had actually completed his professional duties. Harrison was properly embalmed, dressed in his best suit, and laid out with dignity. A detailed note explained Harrison's preferred burial arrangements, including his request to be buried next to his wife Eleanor. Even while committing the crime of the century, Theodore Casimir had maintained his professional standards. The FBI launched one of their largest manhunts in history. Media coverage exploded across every major network. The story of the funeral director who stole $100 million in 100 minutes became international news, sparking debates about banking security, professional trust, and the psychology of white-collar crime. But their target had vanished as completely as if he had been laid to rest in one of his own caskets. By the time federal agents arrived at Casimir and Sons Funeral Home on Monday morning, Theodore Casimir had achieved what seemed impossible: a complete disappearance. His house stood empty, his personal belongings gone, and his business accounts had been systematically cleaned out over the weekend. The FBI's investigation quickly revealed the scope of Teddy's planning. Security cameras showed him calmly loading boxes into a rental truck on Saturday morning, more than 30 hours before law enforcement even knew a crime had been committed. While investigators were still trying to understand what happened to Harrison Whitmore, Teddy was already executing his escape plan. His co-conspirators weren't nearly as fortunate. Danny Kowalski was arrested within a week, his bank access logs providing clear evidence of his involvement. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in prison, Danny cooperated fully with investigators, earning himself a 15-year sentence instead of life. Isabella Martinez turned herself in after 3 sleepless nights, unable to live with the guilt of her involvement. Her cooperation with federal agents resulted in a lighter sentence of 5 years, though she lost her job and her children's respect. Patricia Henderson was never charged, as investigators determined she had been unwittingly manipulated and had no knowledge of the criminal nature of her document work. But Theodore Casimir had vanished completely. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in their history, following leads across 6 continents. Interpol issued a red notice. The case was featured on every major news program and true crime podcast in America. Rewards totaling over $10 million were offered for information leading to his capture. Yet nearly 5 years later, not a single confirmed trace of Theodore Casimir has ever been found. Current theories about his whereabouts vary wildly among investigators. Some believe he's living quietly under an assumed identity in a non-extradition country, possibly South America or Southeast Asia. Others think he may have died shortly after the heist, taking the secret of the missing money to his grave. The most unsettling theory comes from retired FBI profiler Angela Morrison. Casimir understood death better than anyone. He knew how to make things disappear permanently, how to prepare for the inevitable, how to handle the most delicate transitions with precision. Who's to say he didn't apply those same skills to his own life? The money has never been recovered. The case remains open. And somewhere in the world, Theodore Casimir may be the only person who knows how this incredible story truly ends. Share your theory in the comments below. Where do you think Teddy Casimir is hiding? The Theodore Casimir case teaches us profound lessons about human nature and the choices we make when pushed to our limits. First, desperation doesn't discriminate. It can corrupt anyone, from the most trusted community leader to your neighbor next door. When financial catastrophe strikes, even the most ethical person can find themselves considering options they never thought possible. Teddy's transformation from respected funeral director to master criminal happened gradually, one compromised decision at a time. Second, trust is a weapon in the wrong hands. Teddy's 25-year reputation became his greatest tool for manipulation. He exploited the genuine relationships he had built, turning decades of compassion into a criminal advantage. This reminds us to be cautious about who we trust completely, especially during vulnerable moments. Third, financial planning isn't just about building wealth. It's about protecting yourself from desperation-driven decisions. Had Teddy prepared for medical emergencies, he might never have crossed that ethical line. Finally, remember that perfect crimes always have victims. Danny Kowalski lost 15 years of his life. Isabella Martinez destroyed her family's trust. Harrison Whitmore's final dignity was violated for money. Ask yourself, where are your ethical boundaries? What would it take to make you cross them? And somewhere in the world, Theodore Casimir might be asking himself the same question.